So hello everybody, good evening, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to today's webinar. In the meantime, while everybody is still joining us, I'll take this opportunity to introduce a little bit about FABA, today's webinar, and our speaker, Dr. Anand. And so, firstly, I thank you for all for taking out the time to be a part of this webinar here and to know more about being a science communicator. So it is about playing to your strengths to become a science communicator. And Dr. Anand will be touching upon many points that will help you build your career as a science communicator going forward. So, as you all know, e-certificates will be provided for this webinar. But the mandate is you have to fill the form which will be provided by the end of the speaker's talk. And so please definitely fill the form, or else we won't be able to entertain your request of getting the certificate. And now, may I please introduce a little bit about FABA and FABA Academy to our audience today. Well, Federation of Asian Biotech Associations was established in 2005, and it's a non-profit, non-government registered organization. It is created to provide a global platform for development of biotechnology across the globe, particularly in the Asian countries, to promote innovation and entrepreneurship in biotech industry, academia, and healthcare sector. Lack of trained manpower is one of the major problems in pharma and biotech industries. And FABA Academy is a special wing under FABA organization, as we conducted many kinds of workshops, including drug discovery and development. Now that post-COVID, we have also started conducting hands-on sessions for the students. So we already conducted one on chromatography techniques. And so in this year to come, we are ready to launch many workshops along these lines. And so now taking the pleasure of inviting the speaker for today, Dr. Anand Devasthanam, let me tell you a little bit about him. So he's a scientist by training, writer by passion, and storyteller by nature. Leveraging his core experience in communicating science to varied audiences and freelance experience in career coaching and candidate development geared towards career path transitions, he believes that his strong drive is to help and mentor medical writers, and which may offer much to the evolving medical writing world. He works as an associate medical director at a medical communications company, and his role involves working with scientists, medical doctors, storytellers, designers, illustrators, and animators to shorten the distance from lab to life. Outside of work, he spends his time thinking about and developing learning materials about leadership in medical writing, self-empowerment for writers, and strategies for overcoming imposter syndrome. And with this, Dr. Anand, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nizi, for the kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining me today. I feel very grateful that so many have turned up, and I hope you're as excited about this presentation as I am about sharing it. So as Nizi mentioned, today's session is going to be hinged on one word, which is to rewrite. To write something is essentially a combination of two things. Either it's a process of creativity, which you came up with on your own, or it's a process of influence where you've been influenced by many things in your life, and that has inspired you to write something about your future and to write your own future and to write your own destiny. However, you also have the power to rewrite what your future looks like. And that's something that I'd like to emphasize during the course of today's presentation. I would say one of the main takeaways here is that all of us have the power to do small changes, make small changes, and do small things in our lives, which can have a huge influence on the way the future plays out. You know, while growing up, I felt that the future is something which happens to you. All you have to do is to live your life, and the future is something which happens to you. But the truth is, you know, we have to work to build a better future for ourselves. And if we just sit around and wait for the future to happen, will it happen? Yes, because time stops for no one. However, the future that happens is not as under our control, and it may not be exactly what we expected. So the point that I'd like to emphasize today is a few things that we can be doing and a few mindset shifts that we can begin thinking about in order to build a better future for ourselves and rewrite the days that may come. So with that, I'd like to get started with this small deck that I have put together for you. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. One of the key drivers of the message that I'd like to share with you today is that it's possible to play to your strengths. More often than not, we tend to follow someone else's strengths because it's trendy. When someone else is strong at something and they go out and they play to their strengths and they achieve success, we tend to assume that what works for them also works for us. But this may not always be true because we have never really taken the time to do some introspection and try and figure out what our strengths are. And if you are someone like myself who's interested in communicating science and who's interested in writing, it's very important to sit down for a moment and take stock of what we're strong at, because writing itself is such a huge field. And writing is just one aspect of communication. There are other ways of communicating science as well. So given the depth and breadth of this field, it's very important to try and get a sense of what niche we might be most successful in. So it's really important to figure out what our strengths are and then strategize a way to play to those strengths in order to improve our success in the future. So in today's presentation, I'd like to go over a few decisions that I made earlier on in my career, which led me into this path of medical writing. The purpose of me sharing out these decisions is my story is not unique. When I begin talking about how I transitioned from academia into industry, specifically into science communication and medical writing, I realized that many people in my network who were either formerly scientists or who have become writers share the same story that I did. So I wanted to share this out with you to establish some kind of a connection and to let everyone know that if you're transitioning from one place to the next, the transition process can seem quite lonely and isolating, but it's important to remind yourself that you're not alone, because there are many other people who are having the same kinds of thoughts and the same kinds of uncertainties and anxieties in their mind about transitioning from one chapter of their life to the next, transitioning from academia to industry, transitioning from a career which doesn't involve too much writing and communication to a medical writing career, which is all about writing and communication. And secondly, I would also like to go over a few guiding principles within science communication, round that off with a few key considerations within medical writing. And medical writing, of course, any type of science communication for that matter, has obstacles. Whenever you try to add value in life, if you'd like to add value to your own career or perhaps even add value to someone else's life, there will be obstacles. So I'd like to talk about what those obstacles are. And the purpose of talking about obstacles is that when you encounter them, if you know that these obstacles are something that even other writers are experiencing, then it makes you feel a little better about how you can tackle them. So that's the purpose of talking about these obstacles. And finally, how do we overcome these obstacles and enable your future? We'll touch upon that as well. And round off with a few suggestions on how you can slowly begin building your path ahead. So the objectives of today's presentation are to understand the guiding principles of science communication. And as I mentioned earlier, to learn about the key considerations and a few strategies on how you can begin playing to your strengths. So the value proposition is just an industry term for saying, you know, what's in this presentation for me? What can I possibly take out of this? And you might be, obviously, you've taken time out of your day to attend this presentation, and you might be wondering, you know, this better be good, and I hope this is worth my time. So before we begin, you know, getting into the main focus of this presentation, I just want to share that I've tried to include a little something for everyone If you are someone who's just getting started in your writing career, or even just begin thinking about a career in medical writing or science communication, there's tremendous value in this presentation for you. If you are someone who is going lateral, meaning going from a non-writing and non-communication career into a science communication role, there's something in here for you. Or even if you are someone who's leaping tracks, which is if you are already in industry, or you've had previous experience in industry in a non-writing role, and you wish to slowly begin transitioning into a writing role, there's something in here for you as well. I am a huge believer in gathering data and sampling data and talking to people and filtering their insights and learnings into presentations that, such as this one, which get shared out with larger groups of people. So the way this session is built is based on the contributions of people who I've worked with, writers who I've worked with across different experience levels. I am currently based in Boston. The image that you see on the right side of this slide is downtown Cambridge, Massachusetts. Many of the pharma and biotech companies within the United States are based in this really beautiful, sprawling geography. And also many of the writers whom I've had the pleasure of speaking with, working with, and mentoring over the years now work in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so I'm very grateful for their contributions, because it's their testimonials, their words, and their insights, and the information that they have been able to share with me has helped a lot in me putting together this presentation, which I'm so happy to share with you all today. So coming back to some of the decisions that were made in going from an academic career into a medical writing career, I found myself at a crossroads many years ago when I was in graduate school, getting my PhD in immunology. And I knew very little about what it means to be a science communicator. And honestly, I didn't even know that a career such as medical writing existed. But I knew that I had a basic interest in communicating science, but I wasn't sure about how that interest would play out in the future and how I could turn that interest into a career. So I found myself at a crossroads where I could either dedicate the remainder of my career to research and development, or I could do something which I was a little bit unsure of, and something which made me both excited and nervous at the same time. It was a nerve-wracking experience to try and make that decision. So I spoke with many people in my life who had helped me learn and develop over the years. And many years ago, I had a coach of mine who said, you have to play to your strengths. And this coach would always say to me, let someone else worry about your weaknesses. Your role is essentially to play to your strengths and use that to make you stronger. So I thought, okay, if I were to apply this advice to help me overcome this crossroads in my life and play to my strengths, what would it be? And at that moment, when I posed the question this way to myself, it helped me realize that I'm strong at research and development, but slightly stronger at communicating science. So I decided to lean in that direction, even though it was something which made me afraid, it made me nervous, and there was just so much uncertainty associated with that decision. But I just decided to go in that direction and take that risk. Following which, I did a lot of thinking and introspection, and also communicating with other medical writers and science writers in industry about what their day-to-day is like and what it is like to work within the science communication field. And thinking about my strengths and thinking about the conversations that I'd had with people who were already in that role influenced me tremendously. And it really helped me make a decision that I wanted to enter the medical writing field. So you might be someone who is at a crossroads in your life right now, and I just want to assure you that that's completely okay. You might be someone who is having a very difficult time deciding whether you'd like to be in academia, whether you'd like to be in industry. Even within industry, there are just so many roles to pick from, and everything might seem, exciting and doable and interesting to you. So I just want to mention that, confusion is normal, and taking a little bit of time to make a decision is completely normal. And just because a friend or a colleague of yours decided within 2 days what they want to do for the remainder of their career, that doesn't mean it's going to take you 2 days as well. It might take you 2 weeks, for instance, or even 2 months to determine exactly what it is that you'd like to do. And that's completely fine. Focus is, I would say, 50% of the transition from where you are to where you'd like to be. The remaining 50% is aligning everything else with the focus that you decided on. So take time to establish focus, and take time to introspect. Let's go over some of the few guiding principles of science communication. The most basic definition of science communication is a process which brings people closer to science. And I find this definition both useful and beautiful because of its simplicity. I like it because it paints a picture where you have science as one shore and people as the other shore on this ocean, and the bridge that connects these two shores is essentially science communication. So science communication is really about building a bridge between two areas of knowledge. And I find that image very compelling because anytime I talk about science communication, or when I'm writing something, or even if I'm stuck with a difficult project, I often reflect on this definition, and I use that moment to help me resolve any difficulty with the science communication project. So keep that definition in mind. You probably won't find a definition like this in a textbook or in a research paper, because it's something which was given to me by a writer that I was working with, and I had the pleasure of mentoring a few years ago. But I find this definition extremely useful, and I'm happy to share that out with you as well. What you see on the right side of the slide is essentially the four major, the building blocks, or the cornerstones, if you'd like to call it that, of science communication. The first is about being of service to others. The second is inclusion. The third is simplicity. And the fourth is disruption, which means questioning the status quo, introducing new ideas. So let's talk about these one by one. So why is service so important to science communication? Because again, think about the analogy we talked about, using the bridge analogy. So it's about bridging the gap between people and the moving frontier of science. Science obviously is not stagnant. It doesn't stay in one place. There's research going on, there's development going on, there's technological evolution. People have dedicated their lives to progressing science and to going from what is known to what is unknown. And technology has followed the progress of science. Anytime there's a new discovery, and if that new discovery is applicable to any of the existing technologies, or if the new discovery can be used to invent a new technology, then people jump at that opportunity. However, the rest of society needs to be updated on what's going on. And it's kind of a social responsibility of science communicators to recognize the gap between the general public and the moving frontier of science, and try and find a way of bridging that gap. And so approaching science communication from a service mentality and telling ourselves that this is really about being of service to people because they deserve to know about the science impacting their lives. When you approach science communication with that mindset, you just become a better science communicator. So service is just so crucial. The second is inclusion, which is to educate people on how science impacts their lives. The most basic way of thinking about inclusion is to open up a door and invite someone in, or even just to pop the bubble and expose, what's going on inside. And this is important because, science is kind of happening in a bubble, because scientific language, scientific jargon, and the words used to describe scientific innovation is not accessible to most people. There's only a very, very small fraction of people who fully understand the value of research and development that's going on. And so inclusion is a key driver, is a key guiding principle within science communication, because it's about opening up the door and inviting people in and explaining to them what's going on with a scientific project. Even something as simple as looking at the title of a scientific paper and finding a way of translating that title into something that most people can understand. Even that simple exercise is a great way of practicing the process of inclusion, is a great way of practicing the process of inviting people into science and showing them what's going on. The third is disruption, which is to introduce people to new ideas or to change perceptions about existing ideas. I borrowed this definition from one of my professors from a long time ago, who recognized my interest in writing and gave me some really amazing writing quotes, which I like to reflect upon once in a while. And this person first mentioned to me that the whole purpose of writing is either to introduce a new idea or to change an existing idea. And this is specifically writing within the context of science communication. So think about that. Think about how writing can be so applicable, and think about how writing can literally change people's perceptions. And when you can change someone's perceptions, you can change the way people operate, the way people do things. And this really can be tied to changing the world. You change the way you think, you change the way you write, you make your writing more compelling and impressionable and more impactful. The reader feels the impact, hopefully changes their behavior, and it's a small stepwise process to make the world a better place. It seems like a very far stretch that joining words together on a piece of paper and creating sentences can actually make the world a better place. But it's true. When you zoom out far enough and see how writing is good science communication is impacting the way people think and the way people conduct their lives, you can actually see a connection between good writing and change, which is brought about in the world. So think about the value of disruption. Think about the value of introducing new ideas and challenging existing ideas. Simplicity is a big one. It's a huge pillar within the guiding principles of science communication. And it's essentially to help people understand key messages without diluting the science. There's a very interesting quote that goes, "When writing about science, simplify the writing, but don't simplify the science." And essentially what that means is don't try to dilute out or don't try to simplify the data or the hypothesis or exactly what the scientific outcome and conclusions are. Find a way to simplify the writing and make science more accessible to people. Find a way to simplify the explanation and make science more inviting to people without trying to cut down on the complexity of the scientific conclusion. Again, it's difficult to understand some of these things without examples. I don't have an example on this slide. However, I just want to emphasize that simplicity is a huge factor in learning to become a good science communicator. And it's a strange thing that even the most established science communicators and even the most reputed medical writers sometimes get stuck in making something simple, in simplifying the writing without simplifying the science. It's easier said than done. However, it's just so crucial as a guiding principle of science communication. So if you're trying a simplicity exercise, if you're taking a piece of your own writing, or if you're taking a piece of someone else's writing and trying to simplify it, and you find that it's a little challenging, it's not your fault. It's just that simplifying something it sounds easy, but when you actually get down to it, it can get quite complex. So keep working at it. And if you find that it's going slower than normal, that's completely okay, because practice takes time. Now, all four of these factors that I presented, the four pillar stones of science communication, or the guiding principles, so to speak, have one common factor. And the common factor is people. Service is about people. Disruption is about benefiting people. Inclusion is about benefiting people. Simplicity is about benefiting people. And this is a huge difference between scientific progress and science communication, because scientific innovation is about going to a place where no one else has gone before. It's about the nitty-gritties. It's about the numbers. It's about the data. But science communication is about connection. It's not really about explaining to someone why one number is more important than another, why one piece of data is more important than another. It's about explaining why that, how that importance or how that discovery translates to someone's life, how that's applicable to someone's life. It's all about people. If you keep people in mind, if you keep connection in mind, then it's going to help you tremendously to become a better science communicator over time. Now, this is a lesson which I learned rather late in my career, because when I made a transition from being in a place where scientific innovation was prioritized to suddenly being in an industry where science communication is prioritized, no one told me that you're moving now from a data-driven field to now a people-driven, communication-driven field. So I had to figure this out slowly on my own. And many of the initial pieces of writing that I did was very strongly reflective of the more academic type of writing. It's only when I realized that I have to keep people in mind and connection in mind and find a way to make the writing more friendly, more relatable. It is only then that my science communication skills slowly began improving. So I guess the takeaway here is, if you'd like to improve your science communication skills, it's not just about the sentences and the words and the phrasing and the syntax and the way you're writing. All that stuff is important, and all those skills can improve over time. The other thing which should and can improve over time is your ability to connect with people, writing something which people want to read, writing something which people will read and remember, something which is impressionable, impactful, memorable. These are things which take a little bit more practice. However, again, I want to emphasize that keeping that connection in mind and prioritizing connecting with your audience is crucial, because the common factor here, regardless of this area of science communication, is a connection with people. Let's move on and talk about a few specifics, specifically the key consideration in science communication and some of the best practices that expert storytellers use to convey key messages in science. So the first key consideration is that the delivery needs to be targeted. When we write something, it's crucial to keep in mind who the audience is. Let's take a moment to look at the graphic here on the slide. You have these three gears, and the gear of science is something which is always spinning. Okay, because there's scientific innovation which is always happening. And then if you move down, there's a gear of engagement which may or may not spin. And engagement is another way of saying, how is that science connecting with people with engagement? So I like this analogy, and this has helped a lot because, as I mentioned earlier, the science gear is always spinning because innovation is happening constantly, and it's the science communicator's role to create this gear between science and engagement, so that every time the science gear spins, the message spins accordingly in order to get engagement from people. And if we want more scientific innovation in society, if we want a society that is, paying attention to science and prioritizes science and understands the full value of what science is all about, we have to absolutely make sure that every time the science gear spins, the engagement gear also spins. And that's the reason why the gear in the middle that talks about the message, the scientific message, is so crucial. And this really boils down to targeted delivery, because it's really about understanding the needs of your audience and communicating exactly the facts which might be important to them. The second key consideration is clarity of messaging and to keep it simple. So this comes back to the importance of simplicity, which I alluded to earlier. A thumb rule that we follow in science communication is one deliverable, one message. Deliverable is just an industry term for, what are you delivering? Is it a paper? Is it a book? Is it an abstract? Is it an article? Is it an ad for television? Is it a public service announcement? Is it a podcast? A deliverable could be one of many things. One deliverable, one message. So you look at the key message that you'd like to convey to your audience, and you build around it. A common mistake which is seen in the science communication field is that people take a bunch of different bullet points, a bunch of different conclusions, and try and jam all of those into one deliverable. Now, this is an efficient way of getting information across, because you're creating this one platform which is all inclusive, which includes all the conclusions that you'd like to convey, and you're sending it across to your audience. Although the efficiency comes at a cost because it's not as effective. If you'd like to make one clear message saying, this kind of a lifestyle leads to diabetes, this kind of a lifestyle leads to increased cardiovascular disease, that kind of a lifestyle leads to increased risk for lung cancer. These are messages which have been distilled down to the most simplest forms. And if you think about creating that one deliverable, which can be connected to one message, you're setting yourself up for success, because you are prioritizing clarity and clear messaging. And experienced storytellers figure out what the core message is first, even before beginning the whole writing process and the storytelling process. They figure out what the core message is, and then they build around it. They minimize jargon, they improve simplicity. So focusing down on this graphic on the slide, the innermost circle is the foundation, and that is the core conclusions, the core message. And the second layer is support. What kind of evidence can you find to support that core message? What kind of references, anything in the literature, any information that you can find to justify the foundational message? And of course, the outermost circle is decoration, which is how can I make this look better? How can I use words to make it seem more interesting? So that's the outermost layer. One of the mistakes that I've seen science communicators make earlier on in their career is to approach this backwards, which is to think about the decoration first. And they think about these fancy graphics and wonderful ways in which you can make it look really great. Let's do an infographic. Let's do something which is very visually driven. And then look at, okay, what kind of supporting information do we have, and not really thinking about the foundational message. And sometimes even the decoration is present, the supporting information is present, but the foundational message is completely missing in some of the earlier drafts. So it's important to think about this framework for how to communicate science effectively, and give a lot of thought to what the foundational message is, and then think about the supporting points which will support that foundational message. And finally, think about, okay, how can I make this article read smoother, look better, make it more visually pleasing? The next one is also an important one. It's story etiquette, which essentially means how something is traditionally done, or how something is, has been done effectively for a while. And the way it's done in other areas of storytelling is to construct something called a story arc, where you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the reason it's called a story arc is because the beginning has a few facts to get the reader interested in what the article is all about. And the middle is where, the suspense builds up. And within the context of science communication, this could be, okay, all this stuff which is not yet known, but the importance of knowing it and how knowing it would benefit society. That's how you build up the suspense, and you begin describing the outcomes of the research. You begin describing the conclusions of the research, and then you have an end, which is conclusion. What was learned about this research, and how has it helped in progressing knowledge, and how has it helped in getting us to a place which is better, and how will it propel future innovation? These are some examples of what the end could look like. And a widely used story development technique is to start with the conclusion or the outcome, which is to write down the conclusion of the outcome first, and then think about the beginning and the middle in order to support that outcome. So you get a smooth story arc. Moving to the graphic below is essentially the same as the graphic above, except that now you have the principles behind what's going on. So you describe the current mindset, you describe the change agent, and then you move toward the changed mindset. And we often write down a story arc based on these three things. And when I ask writers to produce their first draft, sometimes I tell them make 3 columns on a piece of paper. And in one column, name it current mindset. In the middle column, name it change agent. And on the column on the right, name it changed mindset. So let's say if you're writing about a topic such as vaccination, which has been something which has been very, very talked about over the past 2 years, the current mindset could be, people feel X, Y, and Z things about vaccination. And then the change agent could be different types of vaccinations. You have protein-based vaccinations, nucleic acid-based vaccinations, vaccinations using live microorganisms versus inactivated microorganisms, vaccinations using RNA technology, which we have seen happening with the COVID-19 pandemic. And then you have the changed mindset, which is after reading this article, what is the expected change mindset of the reader? Once you have these points down, you have already constructed somewhat of a story arc. You've at least begun constructing the skeleton of a story arc. And when you look back at this table, which you've just put together, and then begin writing the scientific article, it makes it so much more translatable. It makes it so much more easier in order to think about how to bring the readers from their current mindset and into the changed mindset. Another important key consideration with science communication is to prevent alarmism. Alarmism is essentially a complex way of saying, getting people anxious, or getting people worried about something which a threat which may not be real. There are some threats which are real and some threats which are just perceived. If you take those perceived threats and present them as facts, then that gets the readers anxious, and it doesn't do any good. It doesn't do any good to you as a writer to progress in your career, and it doesn't do any good to the reader because it's not a smooth, factual, science-based reading experience for them. So it's important to keep in mind that good science communication is not unduly persuasive. There have to be checks and balances in place in order to make it compelling and not persuasive. And the second is that a scientific story has a clear objective. It's to educate people and to inform people, and once in a while to inspire people to take action. So as long as you're keeping these objectives in mind, it helps a whole lot with improving science communication skills. So coming down to the graphic here on the slide, it's essentially a funnel. It's a funnel with 3 important components in it. You have data, you have the story, and you have the why. The why is the rationale, why something was done, why a research was conducted, why a project was undertaken. It's very important to mention that. And sometimes it's not clearly spelled out in the materials you may read as background to write something. However, it's important to make sure that you have a few points for all these components, a few points on how you would describe the why, a few points on how you would write the story, and a few points on how you would present the data in order to create something which is factual and something which will not make the reader anxious for no specific reason. Okay. And the final one is to make sure you have a key takeaway message. It's important to remember that people almost never leave a scientific discourse, or people never put down an article with specifics of numbers and figures. People always walk away with, with a message, and it's important to clarify that message. Sometimes I've seen articles which have been written by, very accomplished people in the field, where the data is all very well laid out, but there is no concluding takeaway message. And in order to counter this, one of the things that I've done with many of the writers I've worked in the past is to request the writers to write down the key message first, even before writing the article. I always tell them, just put the key message in a box, draw a box, write the key message in the box, and let's go from there, because it takes time to figure out the key message. And it's important to get alignment on what the key message is, especially if you're writing for someone else. When you become accomplished writers, you'll realize that more often than not, with science writing, you're always writing from someone else's perspective. So if an individual or an organization comes to you and says, I need help with writing this, it's always a good practice to write out a few key messages and say, okay, here are the key messages of the science communication piece. Let's sit down and talk about which key message you think is most accurate. And once you have agreement on what that key message is, you can construct the article in order to arrive at that key message. And secondly, a slogan capturing the core idea will reinforce the take-home message. So any conversational or any non-data containing sentence that you can construct, which again re-emphasizes the key message, helps a lot. Now, a slogan is sometimes used like in the advertising space in order to convey the value proposition of a product or a service. And a similar concept can be used in science communication as well. It's something which is often overlooked, but it's very helpful. Like for instance, if you're talking about the bad impact of smoking or alcoholism in society, for instance, or even if you're talking about the importance of consuming probiotics once in a while, then if there's a way of you creating a slogan which will summarize everything that you've said so far and put it in the form of one sentence, one short sentence, that is probably going to be what your readers take away at the end. And it's very important to give them that tool, because the slogan is what helps people spread the word about what they just found out and spread the word about what they just read. So it helps to create a sense of traction, and it helps to create change in the long run. The other thing to keep in mind is to balance out conclusion with any balancing counterpoints. And this comes back to the fact that science communication is not always one-sided and overtly persuasive. Anytime you have conclusions, if you come across any points in the literature with your research where those conclusions can be balanced by counterpoints, then it's important to present those counterpoints as well. I would say that the presence of conclusions and counterpoints is something which is quite unique to science communication. Every other area of communication, professional communication, is about only conclusions. Here's the data, here's what it is, here are the conclusions. But science communication goes one step beyond, because in addition to presenting those conclusions, you also have to give yourself the freedom and the liberty to present a few counterbalancing points. And it's not really a sign of weakness to conclude something and then present something which slightly disagrees with your conclusion. That's just the nature of science. There is no such thing as, this is something that every single person agrees on. you have a consensus, which results in a conclusion, but you also have a few points which may question the conclusion. And that's the beauty of science. You get to talk about those questions. You get to talk about the fact that there isn't a sense of agreement on something. So keep that in mind as well. Okay. So sometimes writers say they've hit a glass ceiling, an obstacle which they didn't see coming, an obstacle which is preventing them from growing and becoming successful. And this mostly happens because of, constant self-defeat, constant questioning of one's own skills, and just making the assumption that they're not good enough. Imposter syndrome creeps in, and writers sometimes make the assumption that, I can't write anymore. Maybe I should do something else. But this is not really true. And when I've had the opportunity to sit down with writers in different areas of their career, whether they're earlier on or just entered a managerial role, or perhaps even people who have been in a senior role for a while, there are mainly three reasons which cause this self-defeat. The first is self-prestige, which is if people feel like success in the past should lead to success in writing, that's kind of a wrong assumption. People have said to me that, I was a very successful student in university. How come I'm not such an effective science communicator? And I always tell them, science communication is a slightly different skill set. It's what made you successful as a student, what made you really successful in learning the syllabus and being able to answer questions on an exam and being able to get good grades is a different skill set. Science communication is a different skill set. Just because you were successful there, that doesn't mean, you're going to be as successful here. Of course, you will be successful as a science communicator. It's just that you must be willing to learn about the skills of science communication and learn those skills and not make the assumption that success in one area is going to automatically translate into success in another area. The second is poor sampling. Sampling means to do the appropriate background work and the homework in order to create a good written product. The more time you spend and the more effort you put into finding good references, interviewing the right people, finding good testimonials, getting a sense of the ins and outs of the area of science. Like, for instance, let's say you're writing something about lung cancer. Doing all the research, making sure that you've read some really good papers, making sure that you've gotten a sense of what the clinical trials are within the space, and getting a sense of exactly what the article will talk about, and finding the appropriate literature in order to support that article is an example of sampling. Sometimes the article is a combination of science as well as a testimony from a patient who was on some kind of a medication. So if you forget to have an interview with the patient or an interview with the care provider, and you've done everything else, even though you've got all the good literature, you still haven't completed everything on your task list in order to put that written piece together. So if the sampling is poor, it leads to self-defeat. You're sabotaging your own success if you're not doing the homework. And the third is posturing. Posturing means people who use very fancy language for no effective reason. There are, of course, very, very accomplished writers who have a background in writing books and novels and grants and research papers and those kind of things, which requires very flowery, magnanimous type of writing. But science writing is really about simplicity. That doesn't mean your sentences need to be very simplistic. It just means that if there's an opportunity to cut out the fluffy language, if there's an opportunity to cut out the flowery language and just keep it simple, then we should definitely take that opportunity, because simplicity is just so important in science communication. So I present this not to make you anxious or afraid, because that's obviously not the point. I'm presenting this because if you were to hit a glass ceiling or come across an obstacle in your career, think about these reasons. Are you telling yourself, are you forcing yourself to be successful because you were successful in another area of life? And have you taken the time to learn about what science communication is really about? Have you done the homework in order to make sure that you have all the materials you need to put together that writing piece? And have you prioritized simplicity over, complex sentence structure? Because clarity is so important in science communication. Ask yourself these questions if you ever hit a glass ceiling, and you might come to you might realize why you're causing yourself so much trouble because of your own thinking process. So it's important to recognize these as obstacles that you might hit, because when you become aware of obstacles, it just makes you so much more, it just gives you visibility about where you're going, and you can avoid these obstacles. Now, when someone faces an obstacle, what happens? They get these little burnout moments, and they feel like they're a hamster on a wheel. And for those of you who don't know, a hamster is a small, it's a mammal. It's a small rodent which people keep as pets. And sometimes in a hamster cage, they have a little wheel, and the hamster gets on the wheel and keeps running. The hamster feel as if it's going from one place to another, but really the wheel is just spinning and the hamster keeps running on the wheel. And we can feel like this sometimes in our careers, where we just keep working and working and working, and we don't feel as if we're going from point A to point B because we're not getting anywhere. And that's kind of what a burnout moment feels like, where you feel like you're not making any progress. And this can result in, disorientation, where people say, I've published so many papers, but I feel kind of lost as a science communicator. This can also lead to exhaustion, where people say, I feel like I've exhausted my imagination, and that scares me. And this can also lead to some, uninspired days, when you go to work on a Monday, you finish work, you come back on a Friday, and you still feel as if you haven't achieved anything. And you feel like people don't seem to understand that my work requires talent. And again, the purpose of me presenting this is that some of you in the audience today might have said something like this to yourself in the past, and you're not alone. Some of you might come across a situation in the future which feels like some of these statements that I presented here. And again, you're not alone. You're just having a little bit of a burnout moment, and there is a solution to get over this. So let's talk about some solutions and how you can begin enabling your future. One of the tools that I've used, which helps a lot in overcoming self-sabotage and overcoming self-defeat and to get over burnout, is to create something called a strength breakdown. And this is really the crux of how to play to your strengths. There are different ways in which you can create a strength breakdown, but essentially it's a visual representation of what your strengths are. If you have ever been to an interview and the interviewer has asked you, what are your strengths? You would have probably answered that question with maybe 2 or 3 bullet points. But it's not very often that people take the time to actually quantify their strengths. And the strength breakdown is essentially a way of quantifying your strengths. And so I've done this with a very simple pie graph here. And I've chosen a few areas in my professional career that I want to use in order to break down my strengths. So one is, being good at tools, being good at writing tools specifically. And I've allocated a certain percent amount to how strong I think I am with tools. I've also chosen words such as strategist, author, leader, and mentor, and allocated percent amounts to those as well, and created this really simple pie graph of what my strength distribution looks like. When you create something like this, you can use an Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, or you can even just sit down with a piece of paper and a pen and write down, okay, in terms of writing, this is my strength. In terms of verbal communication, in terms of networking, in terms of keeping in touch with others, in terms of reaching out to clients, getting new business, spending time online, making new connections. These are all strengths which you can write down for yourself. And my recommendation is to select between 5 and 7 areas where you would like to describe your strengths and assign percent values to all of them. And again, at the end of the day, it's kind of a self-evaluation, but it's just so important to visualize what your strength distribution looks like. And when you do this exercise once every few months, you get a sense of whether or not your strength distribution is staying the same or changing. If it's staying the same, then you have to ask yourself, why is the strength distribution staying the same? Am I not pushing myself hard enough? Are there areas where I need to be paying more attention? If the strength distribution is changing, then you can ask yourself, okay, where has the strength distribution changed the most? For instance, if I were to do this in the year 2022, and if I were to do this next year again, 2023, and I were to compare these two paragraphs and say, okay, this was the strength distribution last year, and here's the breakdown for this year. What's different? And what's changed? And how can I take advantage of these changes? And where do I need to be paying more attention? You can begin asking yourself these questions and begin planning the way in which you'd like to evolve and the way you'd like to build your strengths, just because you have a visual representation. So to summarize the strengths again of the breakdown process, first off, it helps you build a tremendous amount of awareness, which is it helps you visualize your strength distribution. And awareness is such an important extinguisher, I would say, of burnout and of the feeling of self-defeat. So if burnout and self-defeat are like darkness, then awareness is like the light, which removes the darkness to some extent. Awareness is at the top of the list here, because it's only when you become aware of what your strengths are, you begin to see yourself as a stronger person, and it helps to dissolve feelings of self-doubt. It helps to overcome feelings of burnout. The second is evolution. You can see how your strengths may or may not change over time. If it's changing over time, again, it helps to build awareness. If it's not changing over time, that's also an important lesson that maybe you may not be growing in your career as much as you'd like to. And you can begin asking yourself questions as to what changes you can make in order to improve growth in your career. And the third is when you look at how your skills have evolved over time, you can use that information to plan your next transition. For instance, the strength that got your foot in the door may be different from the strength that helps you climb the opportunity ladder. So when you think about entering an entry-level position, what's important there? You have to be disciplined. You have to follow the rules. You must learn quickly. You must implement quickly, and you must be accountable and responsible. Just a few basic things to keep in mind to be successful in an entry-level role. The same skill set which was helping you in an entry-level role may not help you when you have to become a manager for the first time. It's a slightly different skill set that helps you become a manager for the first time. So if we keep trying to use the same skill sets to progress in our career, it may not work out, because one tool cannot be used again and again and again. When you build something, you may need a screwdriver for the first 10 minutes, okay? And then you might need to change, you might need to use a spanner, right? And then you might need to use a different tool. You might need to use a drill for the next 20 minutes or so. The same is true of a career. You cannot use just one skill set in order to go all the way from the bottom to the top of your own opportunity ladder. It's important to change and evolve, but how do you change and evolve? You begin by mapping out your strengths. It's only when you map things out that you get awareness of where you are, and you get to think about how you can change that strength distribution in order to go where you'd like to go. So when I look back at my strength distribution and remind myself that, life only makes sense in retrospect. It's only when you think back that life makes sense. Life doesn't make sense. It may not make sense for the present moment, and it may not make sense when you think about the future. But when you think about all the decisions that you made in the past, then it slowly starts to click together and make sense. So for instance, I began my career in the health communication space, which is communication of scientific concepts to people with low scientific background, so to the general public. And the strength there, my major strength was I had a very methodical approach. And that strength led me into regulatory writing. And within regulatory writing, I learned a lot about regulations. I learned a lot about managing projects. effectively. I learned a lot about communicating with different clients and making sure everything runs smoothly. But the biggest thing that I learned with the regulatory writing role is I improved my client-facing skills. So that led me into medical communication, which is communication of scientific concepts and ideas to other scientists and medical doctors and key opinion leaders and healthcare providers. I learned, again, many things associated with medical communication, but my biggest takeaway from that role was the ability to tell stories visually, to become an effective visual storyteller. And right now, I work in an ad agency, um, creating advertising campaigns and marketing materials and medical education work and medical communication work, which will go out to a huge spectrum of audience, which who have both scientific knowledge as well as people like the general public who don't have much scientific knowledge. So you have to realize that when you map things out and create a roadmap for yourself, you realize the skills that took you from one opportunity to the next, and the skills that you develop in your current opportunity, the skills that you develop in the current chapter of your life is going to help you in your future. And the only way to see how it helps you is to begin mapping it out. So the path ahead, where do you begin right now? If you're in university now, if you're in school now, and you'd like to start, you have to ask yourself, where do I start now? All this knowledge, all this information that I've heard so far sounds interesting. It sounds cool. But what do I do? Once this presentation ends, what do I do next? Where do I go from here? That's an interesting question. So let me try and answer that for you. The first is to begin implementing. If you'd like to become, the beauty of science communication is that you can begin right now. You can find a scientific article and you can begin translating that scientific article to reach a more general audience and share that out. If any of you are on WhatsApp or any other group which allows you to reach many people at the same time, find a few friends who are equally interested in science communication as you are, and begin a group discussion about science communication. Form a chat group, form a Facebook group, form a LinkedIn page, anything which will help you in creating a small community of science communicators around yourself who will discuss science communication concepts, maybe share out resources, share videos, share podcasts, share sound bites, anything which will help you in becoming better at science communication is something which you can begin doing right now. And the second is to observe, seek out, and collect examples. I grew up in the 90s, and back then we used to have something called a scrapbook, which is essentially a book where kids would keep cutouts from newspapers and magazines and articles. So we didn't have social media back then, so there was no such thing as scrolling on the phone. The only way we would collect things that inspire us is to take a pair of scissors and cut articles out of the newspaper and out of magazines, and then to use some glue to paste it into a scrapbook. So when you look at a scrapbook, when you flip through it, you can see everything which has inspired you over the years. Now, I'm sure there's a more efficient way of doing that online, where you can just favorite things and save things onto a specific folder. Seek out and collect examples of good science communication pieces, videos, podcasts. There's just a lot of good science communication training material out there. So start collecting these things, because even though you may not have time to study all of them now, you will have time. You might have a few breaks in the day here and there. You might have a long weekend coming up here and there, where you can go back to your collection, to your stash, and say, okay, let me use this opportunity to learn. And of course, it's also important to spread the word. Anytime you read an article, and this is an exercise which has helped me a lot. Anytime I read an article about good science communication, I write one sentence as a takeaway, as the major takeaway of that article, which I feel is the major takeaway. And then I share that sentence along with the article out on social media. So when I finish reading something, I summarize it in one sentence, and then I say, hey guys, here is a really interesting article that I read. My takeaway from the article is so and so, and here's a link to the article. So you immediately get to spread the word and let people know that here is something which inspired me. And I hope that it inspires you too. So let's wrap this up with a quick takeaway message. The purpose of science communication is to bring people closer to science. And let's see what science communicators do on a day-to-day basis. So they think about delivery. They think about messaging. They think about what are some good ways to put that messaging across to the reader. They think about clarity, and they think about balance. Can you balance conclusion points with any counterpoints which would be relevant to the reader? Now, it's important to recognize that these processes are put as 5 separate words on this slide, but really science communicators are doing it all at the same time. When you begin communicating science, it's important to try and understand each of these processes separately. But as you begin to practice more and more, you'll realize that your mind will begin doing all these things together. For instance, when you begin communicating science for the first time, you might spend a lot of time thinking about delivery. How am I going to deliver this message? Who is the target audience? Okay, let me write that down. How am I going to construct this message? What is the main takeaway point here? What's the messaging? Let me write that down. How am I going to transmit this message to the audience? Is it going to be in the form? Is it going to be in a written form? Is it going to be a video? Is it going to be a sound bite? How do I get that across? Okay, you'll write that down. How do I improve? So once you have your first draft, you'll think about clarity. How do I make this more clear? You might then edit your first draft to make it more clear. And then you might think about, can I find any information out there to balance these conclusions with any counterpoints? So it's a iterative process where you might practice going from one to the next to the next. But as you begin to practice this, you will realize that you're doing everything at the same time in the future with enough practice. So as you begin writing, you're thinking about the audience, you're making it clear, you're thinking about etiquette, you're thinking about messaging, you're thinking about balance. Everything happens at the same time. It's difficult to kind of imagine it right now when you're starting off. The analogy that I like to use here is, when you play a guitar, and if you're trying to learn some chords, first you look at all the strings on that guitar individually. You place your fingers on that string and you strum each string, one at a time. And then you learn the next chord, and then you learn the next one. And as you get better and better and better at practicing, you can slowly make it sound like music. It doesn't sound like practice anymore. It sounds like music. And the same is true with writing. When you write something for the first time, and read it back to yourself, or when you give it to someone to review it, it might look a bit clunky. It might seem as if you're still practicing, and that's completely fine. But as you begin practicing more and more and more, just like how chords can transform into music, a piece, separate paragraphs coming together can transform into a story, which will be so compelling and leave a solid impression on the reader. And since I brought up this analogy of playing chords on the guitar before we wrap up, I have a little surprise for you. So you think about delivery and messaging, move on to etiquette and clarity. Make sure you have fair balance in your piece. And before you know it, you're learning to play music. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your time. I'm wishing all of you unstoppable growth and huge success, and I'm happy to take any of your questions.